The exit to my apartment decided to disappear by lock letter. I live alone. I really don't like people that much. Having to pay the cashier at my local coffee shop meets and exceeds any social interaction quota I may have. My work is virtual, only requiring a progress report emailed to me by my superior every other week or so. I barely leave my apartment and certainly seldom speak with my neighbors, so I wasn't sure who to talk to when the front door disappeared. I don't mean it faded away or exploded. I mean when I went to leave my apartment building to pick up fast food, there was no door. My brain didn't really compute what was happening, at least initially. I stared at the concrete wall where there had previously been a set of heavy wooden doors. They weren't boarded up or painted over. They simply weren't there anymore, nor was any sign that they had ever been there before. The wall was plain and bare, with the paint slowly fading. I looked around, puzzled. Maybe I was just confused, I thought. Took a wrong turn on the stairs. I walked halfway down the hallway to the emergency exit, therefore, on the other side of the lobby. I turned the corner, reaching out my hand to push open the door, and instead I felt solid glass. The emergency exit was gone. Instead, the window it had been adjacent to was now wider, creating an enormous frosted glass panel. I pressed my face up against it, trying to peer through the opaque surface. I could just barely make out dark silhouettes, probably of passers-by on the sidewalk outside. I pounded once on the glass just to test if it was real and not some sort of hallucination. One of the shadows outside stopped. It came toward the glass, growing slightly larger. I couldn't make out any of the person's features, or even if it was a person at all. It and I stood for a moment, peering at one another through the dark, thick window. I turned around and went back to my room. I bet you think I'm crazy, stupid. So did I. I was running on about 4 cups of cold coffee and 45 minutes of sleep as I churned out a work project last night. I figured I was exhausted and seeing things, or maybe passed out at my desk and dreaming the whole thing. When I got back to my apartment, I grabbed a handful of stale Cheerios and dove back under the covers. When I woke up, I knew things would be back to normal. So you can imagine my alarm when I awoke to a banging on my wall. I leapt up in a daze, nearly falling on my face. There was screaming coming from the wall next to my bed. I recoiled in a panic, my sleep-choked brain struggling to make out any sense of the situation. Finally, I yelled out, asking who was there. The screaming and banging stopped. A woman's panicked voice called back, asking for help. I told her to hold on and sprinted out of my apartment. It was reckless, but she sounded scared. I burst through my door and turned to find the room the voice was coming from. The hallway outside my room was empty. There were no doors. There were no windows at the end of the hall. There was no sign of the staircase to the other floors. It was as if my room opened into a dead-end tunnel. One dim fluorescent light bulb was set into the ceiling, barely illuminating the corridor. I walked down the hallway in a daze. There was no exit, no sign that there had ever been any other apartment doors or any type of entrance. I turned around and saw my room still open, the only blemish on the otherwise stoic walls. I sprinted back toward my room in a panic. Terror gripped me, claustrophobia. The hallway seemed narrow as I stumbled back down it. My shoulders scraped against the walls on either side. They didn't feel like concrete, instead seeming to give little as I shoved against them, like foam or plaster that hadn't completely hardened. Yet, as I pushed, they slowly seemed to press closer. I had to turn sideways now just to continue toward my room, which was barely visible as a thin sliver of light ahead. I was suffocating, drowning. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. It was growing darker. I couldn't see anything, could only feel the cold all around me. I was in a coffin. I was buried alive in a wall. I was screaming. I was back in my room, falling forward onto my welcome mat and slamming my forehead on the floor. I could see. I could breathe. I retched, bile in my stomach threatening to spill out across the linoleum. When I regained my senses, I turned around to my door. It was ajar, revealing a flat, concrete wall. No hallway, no space beyond my apartment at all. I slammed the door shut. I don't know what hour it is, what day. There are no windows in this apartment. There is no door. Maybe there never was. I bang on the wall, scream at the top of my lungs, trying to reach anyone. The woman's voice I heard earlier has been silent. Maybe it was a trick to lure me outside, or a hysterical dream I imagined. Maybe the woman it came from was swallowed alive. My phone is gone, probably dropped out in the hallway. I went to my living room to turn on the TV, but it wasn't there. Just a solid wall where my couch used to sit. I grabbed my laptop from my desk and sat on my bed typing this. The internet flickers on and off. I don't even know if this email will reach anyone. I must have fallen asleep at some point, and when I woke up, my room was smaller than a closet. Now, there's no room to even get off the bed. It forms the floor of my cell. The ceiling seems lower too, just me sitting in a featureless cube, waiting. I'm scared that when my computer dies, I'll be left in the dark. I'm scared to close my eyes. I'm scared when I open them, I'll be unable to move at all. I'm scared I'll be buried alive.
My town was plagued by a series of unexplained disappearances. They have begun once again by Dr. Damnation.
As I put my car into park, a grimace formed on my face. This would have been the fourth disappearance of a month. Stepping out of the car and into the night, I trudged up the path leading to the house and began to prepare myself mentally for what I was about to hear. I have always hated missing persons cases. I think anyone would, but this one was different. When I finally reached the door, I took a deep breath and then broke the silence with a few quick raps on the door. I waited for maybe 15 seconds, but those seconds stretched on for what felt like an eternity. I could hear rustling inside, then 2 pairs of frantic steps approaching. The door swung open, and I was bombarded by incoherent babbling of an older woman who I could only assume to be the girl's mother. Hey, calm down. It will be fine, okay? I'm just going to need to get some information. I looked over to her father. He was a shorter man, heavy-set, and had a cigarette hanging out of his mouth. He seemed less concerned, or at least much more calm. I tried to look him in the eye but failed. Finally I spoke. "So, why don't you tell me what you can about your daughter? Age, what she looks like, where she was last seen, and so on." "Well, she's 16, just got her license. Has long blonde hair." Most of this was information I would already know, but I took out my notepad anyways and began to write down what he had said. "And when was the last time you saw her, sir?" I asked. "Well, last night, she went out with her friends to whatever, hang out. I told her to be home by 12. She never came back. Called her phone, but she hadn't picked up yet. She's been gone for almost a whole day now, and I figured we should probably report it." "And her name?" Ann Walker." I took a moment to gather myself and prepared to depart. I wanted to be out of there. I didn't want to deal with another missing persons case. "You have any other information that could potentially be helpful?" I asked. "Not really. I told you all I can remember." "Well, then I have to get going. If you know anything else, make sure to give us a call anytime. You've given us lots of information. I'm sure we'll find her in no time." That was a lie. I don't know why I said it, but I did. As I turned to return to my car, I heard the door shut behind me, then heard the mother's hysterics once more. I returned to my car and slumped into the driver's seat. I turned the key in the ignition and was finally able to escape the silence of the night. When I returned to the station, I quickly went into my office, slammed down the notepad, and suffered through the monotony of the night. I told myself that I would search the next day. When I finally got home, I collapsed into my bed, but found myself restless. Eventually, I was taken by sleep. When I woke up, my whole body was sore. My bones ached, and my mind felt as though it had been put through a blender. That night was restless, and I felt like shit. That didn't change the fact that I had to go to work and investigate. I didn't expect any leads. Maybe I was being pessimistic, but I didn't care. In my mind, I was being realistic. Despite my body crying out in disdain toward even the thought of doing anything productive today, I knew that it was my job to look into the case. Eventually, I mustered up the strength to leave my house and go to the office. When I got there, I quickly gathered my shit and left. Despite my contempt for this case, along with the others this month, I made haste. I didn't get many leads at first, talking to friends, family members, and whatnot, but eventually I got information. A friend of hers told me that she might have gone to the old abandoned high school. The high school in question was abandoned near the end of the 80s. The student body outgrew the building, and a new one was built. Now the old school is sometimes used by teens as a hangout to drink or get high or fuck. I'm sure this girl's parents wouldn't be fond of the fact that their daughter was out smoking and drinking and doing whatnot, but a lead is a lead. I thanked the friend and walked back to my car. As I buckled my seatbelt, I noticed that the sun had started to set and the chirp of the crickets had begun. I started my car and began to drive toward the old school. As I got closer, the buildings became more and more broken down. They were sparsely populated and less taken care of. The lawns were overgrown, windows were boarded up, signs of now closed shops were faded and barely legible. Despite being 30 or so years since the school closed, the area declined rapidly. The area was like a ghost town, but that's why the kids loved it, I think. They could get away with a lot. Eventually, I pulled up into the cracked and weed-infested parking lot of the school. I parked my car and stepped out. The building was large and made of now cracked brick. It stood 2 stories tall and had large windows periodically placed upon the walls. I walked up the steps to the front door and pushed open the large metal thing. I didn't tell anyone where I was. I knew it was a bad idea, but I personally didn't give a shit at the time. I always preferred to work alone. As I entered the building, I let out an unsure but loud, "Hello?" But I wasn't met with an answer. There was still enough natural light left for me not to need a flashlight when I navigated the building. I was bombarded by a thick smell of must. Underneath, the tile floor was cracked from years of exposure to the elements and UV light, and the sound of my footsteps exemplified it. I remember going to this high school as a student. Seeing it decrepit now was sort of depressing. I turned into a classroom and looked around. There was litter all across the floor, and some desks were overturned. Most rooms I checked in the place were like this. When I got to the cafeteria, it was more of the same. A thick, musty odor pervaded everything, with cracked tile and general uncleanness. I walked toward the kitchen, but something peculiar caught my eye. The kitchen was clean. I didn't think much of it at first, but the longer I stood there, the heavier it weighed upon my mind. Alas, the sun was setting, and I knew that I hadn't covered the whole school yet, and if I wanted to have a chance of finding anything, then I would need to work quickly. I left the cafeteria and began down toward the stairs to the next door. The stairs were wooden, and thus rot had consumed large amounts of them. As I walked up the stairs, I could hear creaks underneath my feet. There wasn't much difference upstairs. It was all the same, rotted and destroyed. As I was searching through one of the old classrooms, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me.
"Hey, I know you're in here,"
I shouted, but I didn't get a response.
"Your parents are looking for you. You need to come home with me."
I shouted once again, but with no response. The footsteps were louder now and more rapid. The sound of them more closely resembled a disoriented shuffle than a walk.
Don't run from me. Stop."
I still had yet to identify the source of the footsteps, and for whatever reason, I was yet to pursue them either. I sprinted down the stairs but came to a horrific realization. The steps were not running away from me, they were coming toward me. I looked down the hallway and saw the silhouette of a figure, but the figure was not human, or at least was no longer. It was hunched over, with huge shoulders and gnarled and disfigured arms. I couldn't make out most of it due to the now set sun, and for that I am grateful. I was paralyzed by fear as I stared down the hallway at the beast. In that moment, I knew what was causing the disappearances in town. I knew what I had to do to stop them. The sudden movement of the beast shocked me into action as I reached to my hip for my gun, but my gun wasn't there. I don't know what kind of fool forgets it at the office, but I fell into that category. I didn't know what to do in that moment, so I ran. Somehow I got out of the building and into my car. I fumbled with the keys, shoved them into the ignition, and slammed on the accelerator. I drove to the office and tried to collect myself, but I couldn't. I knew what I had to do. I just needed to do it. There was no option. I had to return to the school and shoot the thing that resided there. As I re-entered the office, a colleague asked me what I was doing, but I gave him an empty answer. For me to kill that thing, I couldn't tell anyone what I was doing or where I was going. They would just interfere and waste my fucking time. I knew what I was doing, and no one could stop me. I grabbed my gun and walked out of the building, head down into my car. I swung open the door and put the key into the ignition. The night had fallen completely. I pulled out of the lot and began to drive toward the school. As I drove through the night, the buildings around the school took on a more sinister look to them. Years of abandonment hadn't treated them well. Eventually, I arrived at the school once again. I gazed up at the large building that loomed overhead. I knew what was in there. Now it was my job to kill it. I walked up the steps and swung open the door. I felt the crunch of the tiles again under me and readied my gun and flashlight. I walked down the hallway and swung open various doors, but there was nothing. I checked the cafeteria and the mysteriously clean kitchen and noticed a strange door that was left hanging open, leading to darkness. But I didn't have time to investigate the door, so I turned back out of the kitchen and headed into the cafeteria. As I walked toward the doors exiting the cafeteria, I saw it. Standing in the doorway was the thing. It stood there menacingly. I raised my flashlight to get a better look at it and noticed its face looked oddly human. I acted only instinctively. I aimed my gun and began to fire. It tried to run toward me, but was stopped by the barrage of bullets. It slumped down and died. I let out a deep sigh and looked at the now dead beast. It was over. But as I looked at the thing, I noticed something odd. It had a green tag on its ear and one of those disposable wristbands around its arm. I bent down to see what it was, and I felt a pit form in my stomach. Experiment number 8, June 5th, 1989. This couldn't be right. What was this thing? Why was this thing? I don't know. But if this was number 8, there could have been any number more. I needed to investigate. I needed to know. I turned back toward the kitchen and began to walk. I walked for what felt like an eternity, despite it only being 10 or 15 steps. Once I was in the kitchen, I looked at the odd door that hung half open and knew that was where it came from. I opened the door and found a flight of metal stairs leading down to a dark room. Unlike the rest of the school, these stairs were not destroyed. In fact, they looked quite well maintained. I trudged down them into the dark room. I shone my light around it, and suddenly it all made sense. The room was lined with odd glass cages, and various tables and filing cabinets were filled up the middle. In some of the cages sat what I could only assume to be other experiments, but most were dead, or in the very least inactive. 30 years ago was a series of unexplained disappearances, all high school aged. 30 years ago, this school closed and a new one was opened. But then, why were the disappearances happening once again? I noticed something odd. There was no dust down here. It was clean, too clean. I ran through the room and began to look at the cages with the experiments in them. As I read the dates and experiment numbers, the truth was finally revealed. Experiment number 23, May 23rd, 2020. I felt sick as I read the words. The experiments have begun once again.